I have always felt that the most painful tragedy in human life is not defeat, but the slow erosion of the self. It is the moment when a person realizes they are alive, yet no longer living as who they truly are. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon opens precisely in that silent space, where longing exists but cannot speak, where desire is present but forbidden to move. From the very beginning, I am not watching a story about swords or warriors. I am watching people who have already lost something essential long before the first blade is drawn. What appears on the surface as a graceful Wuxia epic quickly reveals itself as a meditation on restraint. Every character walks carefully, as if the world itself were fragile, as if one wrong step might shatter everything they have built. This is a universe governed not only by visible laws, but by invisible expectations: honor, reputation, tradition, duty. These forces do not scream, they whisper. And that whisper is what slowly suffocates the human spirit. I find myself drawn not to the action, but to the stillness between it, where emotions are held back with painful precision. The tragedy here is quiet because it is normalized. No one openly rebels at first. No one declares themselves unhappy. Instead, they comply, they endure, they convince themselves that silence is maturity and sacrifice is virtue. In this world, self-denial is praised, while personal desire is treated as childish or dangerous. Watching this, I cannot help but feel that the film is holding up a mirror not only to ancient society, but to us. How often do we mistake obedience for wisdom, or restraint for moral superiority? What makes this tragedy so compelling is that it is not imposed by villains alone. It is reinforced by everyone, including those who suffer from it most. The characters believe in the system that confines them. They protect it, justify it, and even teach it to the next generation. This is why escape feels nearly impossible. The cage has no visible bars. It exists inside the mind, shaped by years of conditioning and fear of judgment. The tragedy is not that people are trapped, but that they are convinced the trap is necessary. As I watch the story unfold, I sense a deep tension between stillness and motion. The characters are capable of incredible physical freedom, leaping across rooftops, floating through bamboo forests, yet emotionally they remain grounded, heavy, restrained. This contrast is deliberate. It tells me that physical skill means nothing without inner freedom. One can master the body and still be imprisoned by the heart. In fact, the greater the discipline, the heavier the burden seems to become. What resonates with me most is how the film never accuses its characters outright. It does not mock their choices or frame them as weak. Instead, it treats their restraint with empathy. These are not people who lack courage. They are people who were taught that courage means enduring in silence. Their tragedy lies in believing that living truthfully would harm others, disrupt order, or invalidate their entire existence. And so, they wait. They postpone happiness. They tell themselves there will be another time. But time, as the film quietly reminds us, is never generous. In this first movement of the story, I realize that the true conflict is already in place. It is not between enemies, but between who these people are and who they are allowed to be. The swords will clash later, but the real damage has already been done. This is the quiet tragedy of being human, when survival replaces living, and obedience replaces truth. And once that line is crossed, no victory can ever feel complete. When I think of Mu Bai, I do not see a victorious warrior standing at the peak of his power. I see a man who has already reached the end of what strength can offer. At the beginning of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Mu Bai is introduced as a legend, a master of the Wudang school, a figure respected by both the martial world and the imperial court. Yet beneath that calm exterior, I sense a quiet weariness, as if every victory has taken something from him instead of giving. Mu Bai's decision to lay down the Green Destiny sword is not an act of weakness. It is an act of clarity. He understands that the sword, despite its beauty and history, has become a vessel of blood, duty, and unresolved grief. It carries the weight of generations, of revenge, of expectations that no human being should be forced to shoulder alone. When he chooses to let it go, I do not hear triumph. I hear relief. To him, letting go is not surrender, but wisdom born from exhaustion. His philosophy is deeply rooted in Taoist thought. He believes in flowing with nature, in not forcing what is not meant to be held. He understands that clinging creates suffering, and that peace can only be found through release. Yet this is where his tragedy begins. Because knowing how to let go in theory does not mean one is capable of doing so in practice. Mu Bai has mastered the art of detachment everywhere except where it matters most. What moves me is how the film portrays his internal conflict without dramatics. There is no grand declaration of doubt. Instead, his struggle reveals itself in hesitation, in pauses, in the way his gaze lingers just a moment too long. Even as he speaks of retreating from the martial world, something within him resists that peace. He claims to seek emptiness, yet his heart is full of unresolved emotion. This contradiction makes him deeply human. The Green Destiny sword becomes more than an object in this context. To me, it symbolizes the life Mu Bai believes he should abandon, but secretly still feels responsible for. As long as the sword exists in his hands, he remains bound to violence, to legacy, to the endless cycle of conflict. Giving it away is his attempt to break that cycle, yet fate refuses to release him so easily. The moment the sword leaves his possession, chaos follows, reminding him that responsibility cannot be discarded as simply as a weapon. What strikes me most is that Mu Bai's burden is not imposed by others. No one forces him to remain a hero. No one demands he continue fighting. The pressure comes from within. He has internalized the expectations of his role so deeply that even in retirement, he cannot fully escape them. This is the heaviest form of bondage because it wears the mask of choice. As I watch him, I realize that Mu Bai's struggle is not about whether to act or withdraw, but about whether he is allowed to want something for himself. His discipline has taught him to suppress desire, to treat longing as an obstacle to enlightenment, yet the more he suppresses it, the more it disturbs his inner balance. His cultivation falters, not because he is weak, but because he is divided. This is the burden of letting go. True release requires honesty, and honesty demands that one confront what they still hold dear. Mu Bai can release the sword, the title, even the world of martial conflict. But releasing his unspoken hopes is far more difficult. In trying to become empty, he has ignored the truth that emptiness without fulfillment is not peace, but another form of suffering. By the end of this part of the story, I understand that Mu Bai's tragedy is not that he failed to let go. It is that he tried to let go of everything except the one thing he was never taught how to face. And in that imbalance, his fate is quietly sealed. If Mu Bai's greatest struggle is learning how to let go, then his deepest wound is learning how to love without acting on that love. When I observe the relationship between Mu Bai and Yu Shulian, I do not see a romance shaped by passion or urgency. I see something far more restrained, far more painful. Their love exists in silence, sustained not by words, but by years of mutual understanding and carefully maintained distance. What binds them together is not a sudden spark, but shared history. They have walked the same dangerous paths, faced the same losses, and survived the same unspoken regrets. Their bond is built on trust and respect. Yet it is also defined by absence. Everything that should be said remains unspoken. Everything that should be done is deliberately withheld. This is not because they do not feel deeply, but because they feel too deeply to risk breaking the fragile balance they have constructed. Yu Shulian represents a different form of restraint from Mu Bai. While he is bound by philosophy and responsibility, she is bound by moral virtue and social expectation. Having once been betrothed to Mu Bai's closest friend, a man who died violently, she carries the weight of loyalty like a lifelong vow. In her world, honor is not negotiable. To move forward would mean betraying the memory of the past and inviting judgment from a society that measures women by their endurance, not their happiness. As I watch them together, I notice how often they stand close, yet never touch. Their conversations are polite, measured, and filled with implication rather than confession. The tension between them is not created by conflict, but by discipline. They choose restraint repeatedly, convincing themselves that silence is an act of kindness, that self-denial is a form of protection. Yet the cost of this choice becomes increasingly visible. Their eyes linger, their voices soften, their control trembles. What makes their story especially tragic is that neither of them is directly forbidden from loving the other. No authority steps in to separate them. No law explicitly condemns their union. The barrier is internal. It is built from guilt, from responsibility, and from a shared belief that personal happiness must be sacrificed for the sake of moral integrity. They are not imprisoned by force, but by conscience. The moment that stays with me most is when Mu Bai finally admits what he has been suppressing for so long. Facing death, he confesses that he has wasted his life in hesitation, that he has loved Yushu Lian in silence while pretending that letting go was a virtue. In that instant, his philosophy collapses. The teachings that guided him for decades are exposed as incomplete. Letting go, without honesty, becomes avoidance. Detachment, without truth, becomes self-betrayal. Yushu Lian understands him. She has always understood him. Yet understanding does not free her either. Even in that moment of confession, the weight of her upbringing and moral code does not simply disappear. Her tragedy is that she needs permission to be happy, and permission never arrives in time. Their embrace, brief and desperate, carries both fulfillment and grief. It is everything they wanted and everything they lost. As I reflect on their story, I realize that this love was never weak. It was strong enough to endure years of silence, guilt, and sacrifice. What destroyed it was not lack of feeling, but excess of restraint. Their tragedy lies in believing that love must be proven through suffering rather than lived through courage. In the end, their story forces me to ask an uncomfortable question. How many lives are quietly diminished by love that dares not be lived? And how often do we mistake endurance for virtue while calling happiness a selfish desire? In Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, this unspoken love is not a side plot. It is the emotional core of the film and the clearest expression of its quiet, irreversible sorrow. As the story moves toward its end, I begin to understand that Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is not building toward resolution, but toward acceptance. Every path taken, every choice made, has already set its consequences in motion. Freedom, the film seems to whisper, is never free. It always demands payment, and that payment is often collected long after the desire itself has faded. Gen Yu's final journey brings this truth into sharp focus. Having rejected guidance, broken trust, and wounded those who cared for her, she is finally forced to face the weight of her actions. By the time she reunites with Lo, the boy who once offered her a vision of freedom in the desert, the world has changed. Or perhaps she has. What once felt like escape now feels uncertain, fragile, and incomplete. Love alone can no longer shield her from reality. When Lo asks her to stay, to choose a life together away from the rigid structures she despised, I feel the hesitation in her silence. She understands, at last, that freedom is not simply running away from constraint. It is choosing what to stand for and accepting what must be sacrificed in return. The life Lo offers is sincere, but it is also filled with uncertainty, danger, and loss. Jen has already seen how quickly dreams collapse under the weight of the real world. The final scene atop Wudang Mountain is one of the most haunting moments I have ever witnessed in cinema. There is no struggle, no argument, no dramatic confrontation, just wind, height, and a quiet legend about a wish made with a pure heart. As Jen listens, I realize that this is not a moment of impulse. It is a moment of clarity. For the first time, she is not acting out of rebellion or pride. She is acting out of understanding. Her leap is often misunderstood as escape or despair. I do not see it that way. To me, it is an act of reckoning. Jen knows that every path available to her carries consequences she cannot undo. Staying would mean living with guilt, with limitation, with the irreversible damage she has caused. Leaving would mean abandoning love, safety, and the future she once desired. There is no perfect choice. There is only the one she can bear. In that final leap, Jen releases her struggle against the world and against herself. The dragon, long trapped within expectations, pride, and longing, finally moves freely, not toward possession, but toward release. It is the ultimate paradox of the film. True freedom arrives only when she stops trying to control the outcome. By letting go of everything, she transcends the need to win, to prove, to dominate. This moment also casts a long shadow backward over the entire story. Mu Bai sought freedom through detachment, yet could not confront his heart. Yushu Lian sought virtue through endurance, yet sacrificed her happiness. Jen sought freedom through rebellion, yet learned too late that power without wisdom is another prison. Each character reaches for liberation in a different way, and each pays a different price. As I reflect on the ending, I realize that the film never asks us to judge these characters. It asks us to recognize ourselves in them. We all long for freedom. We all fear consequence. We all make choices believing we can control the outcome, only to learn that life does not bend so easily. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon does not offer comfort. It offers truth. Freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the courage to accept responsibility for what we choose. The final leap is not an answer. It is a question left hanging in the air, asking whether true liberation lies in holding on or in knowing when to let go.